tourists, you probably won't. In that sense, they're good, isn't it? Squeeze in.
Thank you. Squeeze in a bit, you're all right.
There you go.
Lovely. Right, malted barley, our next ingredient. When you come into this room, you've got that smell of the malted barley, sort of cereal type smell. And what malted barley is barley which has been malted. That's going to be obvious. Any grain can be malted, and it basically means that you soak the grain in warm water so that it begins to chit or germinate. You allow it to soak for a couple of days, and then you very carefully dry the grain off, drain the water off, and then put the grain in an oven or a kiln and roast it. That stops the germination process, it sort of preserves the grain, and if you turn the temperature up, it obviously starts to burn the grain, if you like, cook it a little bit further. So that we actually end up with various different colours of malted barley, ranging from pale ale malt, which is in this little pot I'm going to pass around for you to have a nibble at, and then the coloured malts, which I'll explain about shortly. So if I give that to you, pass it along, and eventually it will sort of end up back with me, I'm hoping. Now, pale ale malt is a base to all the beers that we do. Even Snecklifter, which is a very dark beer, has more pale ale malt than anything else. And it's our main source of sugar, because within that grain is starch. And later on during the process, when we mix the grist, which is the ground malted barley, with hot liquor, hot water, that starch converts to a simple sugar, and then further along we ferment that sugar into beer. So we need sugar, that's fairly obvious. The darker grains give colour and flavour to the brew. So for a beer like Cockermouth, which is a very pale golden beer, we only use pale ale malt in it, no coloured malts whatsoever. And you end up with a very light golden coloured beer. If you add, say, some crystal malt, which is the next colour, or the next darkest colour that we use, you end up with something like Tom Fool that we're producing at the moment, which has a slightly ambery sort of colour to it, and not exactly sweet, but a slightly toffee or caramel flavour. Now the caramel malt, the crystal malt is in the back bin if anybody wants a little nibble at that later on. If you want your beer to get a little bit darker still, then we have amber malt. And amber's very distinctive. It has a slightly bitter, slightly nutty flavour. And those Jennings bitter drinkers among you will recognise the flavour there. That's where the flavour from the bitter comes from. And finally we have chocolate malt. And the disappointing thing about chocolate malt is we're talking colour, not flavour. That has a very distinctive taste. It's like burnt coffee, and that goes into, among others, Snecklifter, to give it that sort of richness and the distinctive flavour that Snecklifter has. So the brewer's art is to select the right type of malted barleys, mix them together in a way to give you, say, a whole range of different beers, a whole range of different colours. We use between 2 and 3.5 tonnes of malted barley in a brew. The stronger the beer, the more malted barley goes in, because the more sugar we need to get the more alcohol out. The largest brew we do would be 3.5 tonnes, and that would produce somewhere in the region of 41,000 pints, which is quite a few, I'm sure you'll agree. To that mixture of hot liquor and malted barley, we do add other things. Now, I said that we add minerals to our water to make the lighter beers like Cockermouth and Cumberland Ale and so on. That process is called Burtonising. It comes from Burton-on-Trent, and what we're trying to do is make our water similar to Burton. I say similar because we can't make it the same. So we add gypsum and Epsom salts. In the case of some of the beers, might have a little bit of calcium added to them. They all have a touch of salt added to them, just to help bring out the flavours. That's somebody joking about our Epsom salts. Keeps you going, so to say. We use torrefied wheat in some of the beers. You see all these sacks of wheat here. That helps the beer keep its head. And of course you get wheat beers. They're made from wheat with the addition of malted barley, so we're just kind of doing the opposite. And for other beers we might add other cereals. Now I don't know whether anybody got a chance to try Yanchan Tevera in May, which seemed to be a really, really popular beer. It was just a seasonal, and that had golden naked oats in it. That sounds good, doesn't it? And that gave it a really nice smooth finish. And some of you may have had oatmeal stouts in the past, which again have oatmeal too. So there's lots of things that you can put into the beer to just get extra different flavours out of them. But whatever you're using, it all goes through that mill. All the grain, the Burtonising products, the salt, everything goes through there, so it's mixed up together and it ends up in the grist case. Now this mill we don't have to fill by hand, thank God, because production has gone up an awful lot in the last 6 or 7 years, and we'd be doing more than 1 or 2 runs of the sack barrow. We have attached to this 3 big grain silos which are filled from a bulk wagon that comes in instead of them being in sacks. So it's a computer that weighs and elevates the grain. It runs through the mill and it's kicked into the grist case behind. Small quantities we add by hand through the side door, but the work has been very much taken out of the milling job. That doesn't mean to say the workers have been taken out of the milling job, because as I said, in the last few years production in the brewery has risen, so we need those workers to do other jobs around the brewery instead of just being stuck with a sack barrow. The grain we use is all British grown, all English grown. It comes from East Anglia up through Lincolnshire into Yorkshire, and although nowadays we don't have our own maltings, the malt is relatively locally sourced as these things go from either Yorkshire or from Berwick-on-Tweed on the whole, a small amount from Lincolnshire as well. So, any questions at this stage? I've all been very quiet.
How do you get the chocolate colour?
It's just more intense temperature when you're cooking, so that it's basically burned. That's how it ends up that colour. Okay, anything else? Right, we're going to go out into the brew house next, so if those of you there just want to make your way to the